Welcome back, everyone. We have two more panels in the stage area, and then we'll be moving into the sessions area for social hour. I'm now pleased to introduce you to our next panel moderator, Trevor Burke, who will be discussing video scenic artistry from the point of view of content design, lighting design, and projection design. Please enjoy.
Hey guys, welcome back from break. Welcome to Video Scenic Artistry. And we want to take this next 30 minutes to talk about the arc and evolution of video, and specifically how video intersects with production design and set design, and how that has evolved and where we see that going and where we think it can get better, and how this great panel has experienced in the best and sometimes challenging ways. Before we jump into the conversation, I'd like to quickly introduce everyone in the panel. First up, Peter Negrini, who's a acclaimed theatrical projection designer who can bring us a point of view. I'm really excited that bringing a point of view from a more traditional theater perspective, and it's not all about broadcast and live events, and there's a lot of collaborative and creative process that we can, I think, learn from and hopefully kind of cross-pollinate with. Next up, the illustrious creative producer and lighting designer, Corey Fitzgerald, who's been at the helm of some of the most influential live events in recent history, and most of you have known or heard about or read about in the fantastic trade magazines where he has graced our presence. And last but not least, screens producer and content designer Drew Finley, who, Drew, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't your name on the original patent for the original media server back there somewhere?
Not behind me, but yeah.
So who's been part of the conversation since the beginning, and really excited to have as part of this discussion. So to launch us into what we're talking about, I'd love to kind of go around the table, and from everyone's kind of unique point of view, start with understanding, the trajectory of experience, and like how has your understanding of screens as a artistic surface and as a vocation for some of us, how has that evolved over the last decade or recent time? But Peter, start with you.
Sure. I mean, I started in the late 90s when video projector really something that we could use on a large scale yet, and digital manipulation of content was brand new. And what I've really found is that over the last, so that's not a decade, is it? 2.5 decades. What's really happened is that we can start using media in real time. Like, that's been the big change, is that we've been able to change the language we use in live events from things about just humans and static objects to media and content, and really steal all that language from the motion picture, which is what I'm always excited about, is how do we use montage and editing in a live event to tell stories in the way that the movies tell stories, but in the theater.
Cool. And are there any things, if that's kind of like what's changed, is there anything that's more stayed the same that you find kind of a truth that remains, unmoving?
I mean, being the old-fashioned guy in this collection of speakers and coming from the traditional theater, like, you can always go back to that, right? Where it's like, you can make theater with a chair and a light bulb, or a pickle. I mean, whatever. You can make a show. So that's always what, no matter what all this stuff changes, you have to get back to telling a good story and making a good show. The technology is always just a tool.
Cool. How about Drew? What's the arc been that you've seen?
On the stuff that I've done, like you mentioned before, I came in from the lighting world, and it was the beginning of media servers, and we were just starting to say, people on site at concert venues, that's probably where it started first. They're saying like, you know, we want to have a say in what's happening visually in these screens instead of it just being an offsite project, something that gets edited, brought in, and played back like a movie. But from that beginning time of media servers, you know, it was media servers with stock content, and it was a cost savings measure, in addition to being able to do things like match color and speed and things like that with performances on stage. And so I think there was less, you know, there were definitely people interested in the art of it, but as time has gone on, we've all, and our clients have gotten super tired of that. And the technology is serving its role now, where it's able to do whatever we want. And now we have a lot more freedom and maybe not time and money, but that's what we're trying to get, to make what's actually coming out of those servers more relevant to the creative process on stage. Like Peter was saying, trying to tell that story, like instead of just being a piece of background that's rolling around in a 15 or 30-second loop, how can we contribute to the narrative arc of what's going on stage, whether it's whether it's a play or a musical performance or an award show or things like that. And I think that, you know, people's appetite has gotten a lot more sophisticated, and it's allowing us to do a lot more.
Yeah. And like, do you think that appetite, like, what is it kind of equally spread between all parties, like from a screens producer, content creator, artist, or is it kind of, we've become mature enough that we're able to, you know, get a seat at the table? Or where do you think that's coming from?
I mean, to be honest, I think it's coming from everybody's work. You know, as soon as you can do something and it looks cool, and then you turn around and you hear, hey, did you see what so-and-so's doing on tour? Did you see this performance the other night? And all of our clients watch that stuff, and it's increasing their appetite for like, what can we do? So I think everybody's exploration with all of this stuff, it's accelerating at such a fast pace, almost to the point now where, you know, it used to be I found myself trying to educate people in, like, here's some things we can actually do. And now clients are coming with, you know, ideas that are not even possible at this point, but they've kind of been trained already to say, like, don't think anything's impossible, because did you see what so-and-so did last night? So.
That's cool. Corey, get same question to you.
I mean, I would, you know, reiterate what they've both said. My experience comes from, you know, lighting world as well. As a programmer and designer, you know, I was programming when Catalyst came out, and I was actually working with High End at the time, and kind of was like educated very quickly on how does this work, why does this work, how do we use it from a console perspective and a playback perspective, thinking it from a lighting device or in the lighting world. So like growing up, you know, literally with all those consoles and media servers and learning the different ones, brought that perspective of real-time kind of manipulation of whatever it was. And yes, going from stock content of 15-second loops, you know, the stock library, to buying your own stuff, or, you know, going out and making your own things, or learning motion or you know, After Effects, whatever it was, to kind of build certain things was a you know, for me, it was a learning process, because it never was something I thought I would end up doing from a lighting perspective growing up, you know, thinking I would end up in theater and doing sort of traditional Lico lighting on Broadway, to doing sort of concerts and a whole different world that I never really thought existed, you know, 25 years ago. And it's built itself over time. So I think that, like, to me, that's been my journey, to watch it go from, like you guys have been saying, something that was, you know, how do you manipulate, how do you tell a story with it, to it's becoming so central. I mean, we're with this new kind of advancement in technology and, you know, augmented reality and extended reality, like, it's so central to how that story gets told, that you need to know so much about it and use it, and then push it farther than it maybe wants to get pushed, or try something new. And yeah, as Drew said, like, I get emails, clients texting or whatever saying, you know, did you see what so-and-so did? You know, we want to do something more, or how do they do that? What else can we do like that? That's totally different. So it's thinking of those tools as just another paintbrush, but a very, you know, complicated one that has a lot of depth to it, and it can be sort of infinitely complicated depending on how you want to play with it.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing that I think is interesting is like in the event and the live event, concert, and corporate, even to an extent, the more, traditional commercially markets, it does feel like people look backwards or see something that's on Instagram or did you see this? And that's what sparks a new conversation. And like now they're starting to hop. Like did you see this thing, in this app, that is AR? And it's like, I want to do that there. And it's like, well, that's a really big stage and that's your phone. Like those are different levels of entry. But I guess that's a long way of going. Peter, I'm curious, how does that compare to in the more traditional theater world, which I feel tends to be less iterative and like, look at this and evolve it out of that? Or am I missing the mark? Like,
I mean, I think it's less iterative in it's like, in that it's not that we're trying to make something, it's like 2 levels removed, right? Like, I mean, look at this movie and how do we tell a story like that? Or, so I think, but it is still incredibly referential. I mean, this theater has been stealing from everybody forever. I mean, rigging from sailing ships we stole, right? So it's absolutely about absorbing everything that's around you, and then figuring out how to turn it around to what you want to make and putting it back on stage. So I think we're absolutely doing that. And to jump off what the other guys were saying, also, like, it is, I think of it as like this fantastic arms race with the audience, right? Like, can I be cooler than they already are? And can I show them something that still amazes them? And it's like, and that's such great fun, right? And the audience is becoming so sophisticated, visually sophisticated, in terms of production value. They're so sophisticated that it's like, we just have to keep one step ahead of that. And it's fun. It's great. And it's exciting. And I feel audiences are smarter. Like, I don't know that they're actually smarter, but visually smarter, because everyone's consuming media and seeing visual stories so often that you can do a wink and a nod and they're going to pick up a reference, or they're going to watch a show that these guys have designed and be like, oh yeah, I remember that's like something that's a jumping off from some other concert I saw. And that conversation is really cool, I think.
I mean, that makes total sense. But I guess, across the board, Corey, how do you think you contend with this idea of, one-upsmanship? Like, is there an end to it, or is it like, where does it go?
I mean, I don't think there's an end. I think it's natural in any art form. You iterate on ideas, or you see something as a reference. The only way to sort of communicate in a visual medium is through visual references. So even building tours or pieces for a one-off performance, you start with a sort of visual medium, with either it's a reference or a render. So people I get sent things all the time of like, I love this idea, or I saw this on Instagram, and it's just cool. The artist's interpretation of why they like it might be totally different than why I think it's technically cool, or why I think it's colors, or good use of light or shadow or whatever. Like, so having that relationship as a designer and now producer of sort of getting into what those mediums are, like what does it mean to them, and extrapolating how to recreate it or recreate what's important about it with the time and budget we have, it's going to end. I think that, I guess the long story short is that is going to keep going the way it's going to go, and it's going to get more and more complicated, and we're going to have more and more examples of things to see that, especially in this time of innovation, shall we call it, of using technologies in new ways that don't involve audiences and don't involve traditional storytelling that we've been used to. We're forced to do a bunch of different stuff that no one's ever really had to think about, or accelerate development of technology that was probably a year or two out. That's now, we have to use it this week, because otherwise no one's going to get it. So that's going to, I think, force a lot of things to get more iterative of in and of itself of what we're doing now, but it's going to push it to, so what else can we do with this technology? What else can we do with AR? How can we make the next magic trick look cool? How can we do audience interaction? Like all these questions that we're talking about every day in every conference call with every client and every producer. Like that's what's going to be. Somebody's going to do it. They're going to do it 10 different ways. Someone's going to do it right, and that's the way we're going to do that for a while. Someone's going to do. We're going to try something a bunch of different ways, and we're going to what actually works and what's actually profitable and what's actually successful with the artists. So like I think we're going to go down those paths, but it's keep pushing it forward and forward and forward.
Yeah, awesome. I want to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit more about where video more traditionally intersects with scenic design and production design. And I think this is kind of interesting because we have three cool and different entry points into this theatrical and broadcast and touring. But I kind of am interested to hear everyone's thoughts about kind of like where the medium intersects with that, with production design, with scenic design, and what happens when that's successful. We look at the history of more broadcast shows, and screens used to just kind of be an add-on in a similar way as plugging holes and have a little loop in the background, and now screens are the set. Peter, how is that working, and how has that worked in on the theatrical side of things?
I think theatrically it's about like the degree to which you thought a set designer was going to design every moment of a production. And I think what's happening now, and it seems applicable across the board, is it's like you now expect scenic designers or production designers to design more of a toolkit. Like, give me a play space, give me an environment, an installation. I think about a show I did where the designer just gave me a giant angled mirror and a sand floor and said, you do the rest. And so that the production designers are giving us a volume of space to then put content into. And the great collaborations are the ones where the production designers understand that's the relationship with content, with video, that they're making a kind of building a canvas and then we're going to fill the canvas. And the not great ones are the ones who haven't figured that out yet, but they'll come along eventually, I suppose.
So like what it feels like in the the not great ones, or maybe potentially the approach of the past. Is it fair to say it was more kind of traditionally like, I'll build a set and then you just kind of project light on places where you think is suitable versus thinking about it more integrated?
Yeah, well, and also, you have to understand, like, they were designing sets before there was projection, right? So it's like back in the really good old days, they needed to address the look of the show on a moment-to-moment basis. They're just doing what they've always done. The trick is, like, now we've shown up and with new ways of telling stories and new way of making stages. And I think that those people who are progressing or getting a more modern view of it are realizing that the real success is when they leave space for what projection and content can do, and then are building with us, like their volume of space plus the content we're making, that makes something that is dynamic and exciting. And it's about because we talked about these things sometimes happen in sequence. They show up first, oftentimes, perhaps unfortunately. Them really leaving space for that conversation is, I think, the important thing that we're working towards with set designers or production designers.
Yeah, and Corey, how has it evolved, or what's your interpretation of that intersection?
I think it's very much as it's evolved, it's become an obvious point of the entry point is very critical, right? So as I was thinking the other day, it's sort of the difference between a collaborator and an executor, where you bring someone in, and I'm sort of can't say if I'm great or good at this or not, but bringing someone in at the right time to sort of say, as a director or producer or creative vision of like, this is what the show needs to be. I need someone who can help me, create that content and create that space and create that atmosphere. And here's my general idea. Here's my still rendering, but obviously I need someone to come in and help make each song different, or each, section come to life. But it's where you bring that in and just say, I just need something here, versus here's the feeling of this act, and here's what the content needs to feel like, and here's my references, and here's what it's going to look like, and do we need to make the screens bigger? Do we need to deal with perspective? Do we like having those conversations in a what I think of as a theatrical collaboration, versus just here's the back walls for the TV show, and you guys do whatever you want to do. To really have that direction and discussion amongst everyone, I think is very important. And the sooner it starts to happen, the better the results will be, because everything takes time, and content has a fixed time of actual rendering and deliverables and process of like actually facilitating it. So cramming everything to the end means you just have less choices and less options. But the sooner, I think, the better is a needed change to the way things work.
Drew?
I agree with most of all of that stuff. Like, I think like in the beginning of stuff for me, there was, to be honest, almost all the time, the production designer is involved first. In my cases, I'm coming in later, depending on the shows when. But over time, there's been a lot more collaboration. And I would say in the beginning, that there was definitely a lot less. And working, it all depends on the production designer, that you work with different production designers. Like, you start to get a little bit of a shorthand, and there starts to be, we can fix some of those things. And to be honest, the technology is actually helping advance it a little bit in my area, because that's what production designers are coming and saying, listen, if we're going to use this technology, how are we going to effectively do this? Like, these kind of gags require the staging to be set up correctly for them to work. But I think however it, wraps up, the more collaboration between all of the departments, the better the art is going to be, right? So if the person who's designing the lighting and the sets and the content are all collaborating on the same page, we're going to get better products. And that's, to be honest, when we look at these products, when we look at the references and say, those are what we want to use as references on another project, it's usually because there was a lot of collaboration between people. But yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. And there's usually, sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Oh, just one of the things that, that comes to mind about that I think is really important. I didn't realize for a long time in my sort of career is as the sort of new entrant into this, right? There's been costume designers, there's been lighting designers, there's been production designers, with screens and content being the new thing. In any production team, I am the expert in how to do that, right? That sounds obvious, but sometimes you can forget it. And particularly, I'm the expert at how other departments should collaborate with me, right? And taking the time to say, this is the way this process should work. This is the way we collaborate on screens. This is the way we collaborate on content. Almost every single time I've done that, everyone's like, then thank you how to work with you, because I don't understand how I'm supposed to, as a production designer, interact with you. And that's becoming less true as screens and content become more common. But I think it's always important to remember, like, when we show up too late, it's worth saying, gosh, we would all be doing so much better if you called me 3 weeks ago, and that process of sort of developing and working on how we want to work with other designers is really important, and kind of can make the difference in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think that's super valuable. And I think it's true across the industry. Like, if people are struggling to, standardize titles and naming, it's, how people actually interact with one another and interact across departments is, yet even further along. So I think it is interesting. And, some of the other previous panels have talked about the idea that, that's kind of why little tribes form of people who are comfortable working with one another, because that shorthand is also, understanding that you can leave Drew this opening and he'll pick up the slack, or, Corey can say, we need to figure out screen size later, but, he knows what's on his plate and what's not, and, having faith in your collaborators. But like Corey, from a producer standpoint, how has that been changing for you? Like, what the expectation of that collaboration is, and like, how do you do it when it's with with new folks?
I mean, I think the idea of a shorthand is real. I mean, there's obviously teams that you work with more often that you can just sort of understand and use that experience to comment on what's about to happen. And when you have a new team, it's definitely harder to come in and just you have to be more hands-on and describe, more what their responsibilities are. I think delegating specifically, this is what we expect. This is when we expect to see things, and getting that all out there in the beginning and being sort of very specific helps. And then as you develop the relationship more and more, it becomes more loose, and you can kind of understand when things are going to happen and give ideas and know things are going to take longer or whatnot. But I think just for me personally, having enough experience to be dangerous, to know how video works, to know how screens work, and know how servers work, and know how consoles work, just have enough rough idea to have realistic expectations of time and budget to sort of be able to ballpark things and say, well, this, I understand this is going to be hard to do, but we don't have the budget for that, so let's take away from here and put budget in here for that, and sort of having those conversations and being able to pivot as you go. I think that's important, but definitely the dynamic relationships with collaborators evolves as you work more and more often with them, and you discover what works and doesn't work. I mean, I've had both great collaborations and not so great, and it really becomes clear when things are just sort of working correctly as you look at it from afar.
Drew, like because I know we talked about like some of the production designers that you have ongoing relationships with, like that shorthand has become established, but how about in a new relationship on a new production? Like because I think we all sometimes absorb the sins of the people who have sat in our seats previously. Like, you have the same title, you're the same budget line, therefore you're going to do it the same way or think about it the same way. How have you, when faced with that, like, how do you put your own stake in the ground of like, this is how I do it, this is how I run my team, this is how it's different?
Yeah, I mean, that is really hard, right? Especially because we use terms and titles and screens that between different shows mean completely different things. Like, I'm a screens producer on a lot of the broadcast shows I do, but the shows that hire me expect me to be in charge of the creative for the content. And that's not the case on other shows where someone may be a screens producer. And so like if someone calls me up, especially like it's usually, an executive producer or some creative producer, and says, we're looking for a screens producer on their show, I have to get into a conversation with them, which is kind of weird, right? In 10 years, we probably won't have to do this, but what are you looking for? Like, are you looking for someone to manage your technical aspects of how you're going to get all of your content to the stage and deliverables and all that? Or are you looking for a creative? And sometimes, to be honest, people don't even know. They say, well, so-and-so was in that seat before. I'm not sure. It's tough, but that's why I try and have those conversations right from the beginning, especially because in screens, we're expected to be not just, if you're designing screen content, you're not just the designer of it, you're also the shop. You're taking over all the roles that in like a production designer's role, they would design scenery, they would, get it budgeted out, they would say, this is what it is, and that's just not the way it is. If you're creating screen content, you're doing all of it. So trying to stake in the ground in the very beginning what you plan to do, especially for the budgets that are there, I think it's super important. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of unhappy people.
Yeah, and it does definitely feel like you have to kind of, when you get that call from someone you don't have the shorthand with, you have to kind of sniff it out and do a little interviewing as to, you know, what the expectations are. Or, you know, I've even had producers where, you know, we just talk about, like, here's how the whole world works from video, like from shops to gear. And it's like, we're going to, you know, we'll talk for an hour. I mean, if they're willing to have that conversation, we'll talk about it. And then we can talk about, like, okay, here's the people who do this, and here's the people who do this, and all of this is my responsibility. And this is how you get to your show. And you know, sometimes that's really received really well. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for a great conversation. Thanks everyone for sitting in on this panel. I'd like to toss it over to Soren West on the startup mindset. Enjoy, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.